We have Steve Robbins, who is a principal research scientist in the new, and I say new, brand spanking new, Center for Academic and Workforce Readiness and Success at the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey. He provides intellectual leadership to a team of scientists conducting research to address how better assessment can bridge education to work readiness and success from a talent supply chain perspective. Robbins, who was recently Vice President for Research at ACT, he was Vice President for Research at ACT, I know when we first invited him back before Christmas, and he, between that time and I guess January 30th, is that fair? Is also a former professor and chair of the psychology department at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is a nationally recognized for his research on the interplay of cognitive, personality, and behavioral and career factors on education and work success. And he co-authored a chapter in the recent volume of Readings in Equal Education. After Steve's lead, kind of contextualizing these assessment issues, and he can give us a very comprehensive assessment given his deep leadership role at both ACT and his current collaborative work with the team there that we have worked with also for the last 4 years, who headed up what was called the Center for New Constructs at ETS, and they are now reorganizing this under his leadership. Krystal Williams, the second the second person on the panel, is a doctoral candidate and research assistant at the University of Michigan Center for the Study of Higher Post-Secondary Education. Her research focuses on financial aid policy and college access for underrepresented groups. She will speak today from her chapter on the origins of the SAT test in higher education. Third, and of course he's been introduced already to some degree, Bill Sedlacek is Professor Emeritus of Education at the University of Maryland, College Park, has won numerous awards for his research on racism, sexism, the isms, as he calls them, and college admissions and advising, and has served as an expert witness in many race and gender discrimination cases. He developed the situational attitude scale and most recently authored Beyond the Big Test, Non-Cognitive Assessment in Higher Education. He speaks today from his chapter on using non-cognitive variables in assessing readiness in higher education, an area in which he is recognized as a national and international expert. Last but not least, we have Ted Spencer. We have the honor of having Ted Spencer, who's Associate Vice Provost and Executive Director of Undergraduate Admissions here at Michigan, and is a national expert, obviously, as most of you know, in his own right. Prior to his responsibilities at U of M, Mr. Spencer was an Associate Director of Admissions at the United States Air Force Academy. He has been recognized for his outstanding leadership in counseling and assisting students in attaining their educational goals. Within this panel, he will provide and reflect on the utility of the SAT in holistic undergraduate admissions, which he's responsible to steward here at the University of Michigan. He also is going to give a parallel conversation about kind of status and strategies and challenges with the holistic review in a breakout session at 3:45. So now we'd like to start this panel by moving to Professor or Dr. Steve Robbins.
Well, let me start by adding my own thanks and also cause for celebration today of this wonderful center that's a jewel in the Michigan crown. We had a really interesting meeting yesterday afternoon as part of a technical advisory group for their federal funding, and it occurred to me that any center that sort of organically connects the science, the teaching, and the public policy and advocacy legs, as well as this one does, is doing something right. And it's a pleasure to have Krystal on the panel. Their doctoral work is really phenomenal coming out of the center, which is a science mission. And So it's a real honor to be here and to be with this esteemed panel. Shifting gears and to wake you up a little bit, this is about moving forward. Once summer, I took our daughter to Barnard for their summer program, and I took her to a play, and it was Inherit the Wind with Christopher Plummer and Brian Dennehy, and we actually were able to sit on the stage as part of the jury box. So we had a view of these actors from behind, and it turns out Christopher Plummer is a Shakespearean trained actor, and they're trained to enunciate by spitting. So this poor actor had to sit on the jury stand while Christopher Plummer basically just covered him in spit. Now you couldn't see that from the audience, but you sure could see it from the lighting from behind. So my point is I'll try not to spit on it. So. My mission today is really to do three things, is to frame what a comprehensive assessment solution might look like from an evidentiary base. It's to put that solution within the context of what I call, and actually Dr. Nivet, interestingly, we talked yesterday, calls a talent supply chain, stole it from him, and how to understand that these issues that we've already heard from the previous panel of what are the key elements of success actually across the lifetime. They may be contextualized differently, but we'll see them, and we need to think in terms of long pipeline and STEM. And I think that's a theme already emerging. And third, the importance of assessment innovation to really address these issues of high stakes assessment, measurement standards and practice in a way to allow us to achieve the policy imperatives that we've already been talking about. The mission of the center is before you. It's a very exciting time to be at ETS and to be in this center. I've already learned in 7 weeks more about what I didn't know than I ever thought I knew. There's a huge international footprint that ETS has. The work and innovation has just been spectacular to see, an ability to bridge the needs and the constraints of not only education but the workforce are really compelling and very exciting as an innovator, which I consider myself to be. So I'm an individual difference guy. It's hard not to think in terms of the individual and to think about those characteristics related to ability and acquisition of knowledge, personality or behavior, and career. I'm also an old career and counseling psychologist. And here's what we know. Well, I mean, we know that what we learn and our ability to learn is the foundation that really drives task performance, whether it's in education or work training readiness or in the workplace. But we also know that there are these behavioral and personality-based components that are also key. They're key to learning, they're key to the differential outcomes of education and work, which include in the IO and workplace side, it's organizational citizenship behavior and counterproductive behavior and the ability to team and to be customer service oriented and to stay and get your job done no matter what. And those are elements that we see essential within the education space as well. What we don't know is, how do we transform what's really a laundry list of constructs and models and maps into an informed model that we can test and that deals with developmental growth and sequencing. And interestingly, for this talk, I pulled one of the center slides from last year, and we ended up, my colleagues, Patrick Killinan and Richard Roberts, are heroic. They have heroic work ethic. They're up in the middle of the night talking to each other, and I told my boss, Ida Lawrence, if you think I'm doing that, you're out of your mind. I'm old, and so I'm not working at 2 in the morning, and they do. But we had this really interesting talk because here's all the things we measure just at our center. And a lot of them Sed will talk about within the context of his non-cognitive questionnaire, and we see them in 21st century skill frameworks. We see them in the old SCANS initiative from the Department of Labor. We see a lot, Conley's Habit of Mind, or a lot of these. But the real question is, can we sort them into a meaningful model to help us inform this notion of pipeline? So here's Robbins' model. Now, I usually hesitate to use this at a university because the scientists in the audience can take me off at the knees. You know, what's inherited, what's learned, how do they interact with each other? Is there really a sequencing event? But I think it's important to think even proportionally in terms of validity that cognitive development and acquisition of what I would call these foundational skills, academic learning and achievement, measures of work, contextualized cognitive ability, they just drive the likely success of our students and our workers. Layered on top of that, and I like to use a motivational engagement and regulatory sort of model, but there are other models. They layer on top of that and provide validity. They also provide an explanation of why people who come out of less rigorous environments actually do quite well when they have access to resource. And so surrounding this model, and I'll talk about the career in a second, element, is a notion of social capital and school and work factors. So when we do our research, we always take into account second order effects having to do with, if it's in education in K-12, it's the rigor of the school environment. If it's within work, what is the culture and mission of that organization? What's expected? And regardless, what are the resources available to someone as they encounter the demands of education and work? And do they have the ability to take advantage of those resources regardless of what's there? Because as it turns out, and we call this now the Matthew effect, it used to be called the psychological resource hypothesis, it's not just providing resources, which is a big issue, but it's people being able to take advantage. And from a policy implication, what we're starting to learn is that if you go into middle schools and high schools and provide additional resources, those kids most able to take advantage of those resources accelerate. They accelerate their learning. The kids least able to take advantage of those resources stay flat. Well, so you know what an unintended consequence is? That the gap between the able and the less able actually increases rather than decreases. So you're raising the tide for a subgroup of kids, not all kids. And so these end up becoming really pretty important issues. Nonetheless, I think the last individual difference component, which is how to make informed choices, and believe it or not, we have many studies now that have shown that the degree to which you choose a college major or career, that fit between your own interests and values, which are not ability driven, they're more personality driven, and the college major and career choices you make affect college major stability, retention. We have a study in labor economics looking at earnings 15 years post college graduation. And it's after you run the traditional Mincer models and you control for ability, gender, it turns out that this very distal measure of college major fit is predictive of earnings. So the career piece tends to be overlooked, especially in my business, but yet is a really critical component. Now, other than the fact that this is a little self-referential, I just want to take a second and talk about the human side of this pyramid, because for the last 13 years, I moved out of academia, escaped the mysteries of higher education, and have been in basically very large transaction-based assessment houses. And yet ETS cares very much about these contextual factors. So let me just tell you the story. The older man on the left came to the United States as a young man on a bought passport through Ellis Island. It was Rabinowitz. He Americanized it to Robbins. The first thing that happened to him without anything even speaking English is he ended up in World War I on a troop ship. He was in the Army and served in Siberia, came back, and his business was to buy used burlap bags and resell them. He made a good living. He did it whole life. He was determined that his son get an education. So the guy on the right went to Wilbur Wright College in Old Humboldt Park, saw Bellows stomping grounds. World War II intervened. He went off to war, came back. The little guy on the left came along. He never finished college. He went into business, couldn't manage the changing environment of small stores versus shopping centers, and ended up being a salesman his life, and always said, you know, you can never take your education away. I wished I had finished my education. So he got caught in a changing environment. The guy on the left went to college. He had no choice. He went to University of Illinois because his parents said, you're going to college, you're going to public school, that's what we can afford, and you're going to University of Illinois because that was a good school. He lasted 1 year. He dropped out of college with his roommate. They had a little store that sold Levi jeans, and they booked local garage bands in Champaign-Urbana. Roll forward, God knows how many years, and his boss is the CEO of Ticketmaster, Live Nation Frontline Management, never finished college. The little guy on the left there has an MBA and manages money for high-profile groups. So he obviously moved back into education on and off as the needs arose. The little guy on the right is me, the most handsome of the bunch. And I thought, my first job was going to be at Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas. My wife didn't want to live in Topeka. I ended up in the university. I thought I was going to be buried in the university. I ended up at ACT, and now I'm at ETS. And so the point of this is we all have a unique story that needs to be told. And no student should get out of the K-12 system without some grown-up in their environment knowing their story. And those stories, guess what, are nonlinear, and they're indeterministic. Even Bandura, when he retired in the 70s, and I'm going to say this crudely because I know I'm on TV and I should do this, and so I'm a rebel. But, you know, he called it happenstance in a life course. I would call it shit happens. And it does. And so how do we understand the progression of individual development across the life course when we know that factors intervene, whether it's war or an economy, or just whatever the life circumstances. In the meantime, from a policy perspective, business has absolutely no confidence in the education system to put out ready workers who can compete in a global and changing environment. And education generally doesn't see itself as a talent supply chain provider. And I purposely use that phrase because I think it's important for us to understand the push-pull of the development of our individuals as we compete in a global world. And even the innovation that the Board of Medicine is doing around the pull, the expectations that physicians have to demonstrate a range of ability and behavior, and tying that to accreditation is absolutely where we need to go, and it will be an important way in which we pull ourselves along from the push of education to address these holistic issues. And the last thing I'd say is we own our career path and our transfer of skills. My brother and I are actually maybe ahead of the game since we've changed jobs several times, but the fact is that we own our skill sets. He got an MBA because he was managing large sums of money for rock and roll groups, and he needed to have that. I have sort of tooled and retooled as my thinking and my work has changed, and I realize that I own those skills. And the days of working someplace for your whole career are over anyways. So what do we do to equip our youth and our students as they go through this supply chain to compete and to seek opportunity as it's presented them? And it would be naive to think that all people have equal opportunity and the resources are the same. They're not. But given what those resources are and the hard work that we all do, that people like Nick Collins does with their outreach programs, and many of you do, you know, what do we do to promote student growth and development in this holistic model along these critical transition points? And so as I moved out of the university into a not-for-profit, or as my former boss Dick Ferguson said, a not-for-loss organization, and I'm interested in what we call product architecture. How do we create the right assessment that are psychometrically strong enough to capture reliable and valid information, but robust enough to really tap these key individual components across the education workspace? And that's what I work on. I work on building these assessments, and I work on them in a way that allows us to address issues of faking and coaching, et cetera, which I'll talk about in a second. Actually, I'm going to talk about it now. So if you think about what the challenges are for a place like ETS, how do we address faking and coaching? We're working with a global customer right now, 250,000 employees worldwide. I've been on a teleconference in their facilities in New York with Brazil, and we're trying to help them broaden their pool of candidates for competitive jobs across IT, service, and consulting sectors by job level. And how do we do that in a way where they're comfortable that the sort of behavioral assessments we're providing are not susceptible to coaching and faking, because especially in many countries in the world, this is just sort of a cultural phenomena. How do we deal with subgroup and cross-cultural comparability? ETS does a lot of work for OECD through PISA and through PIAC, the program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. Think 37 countries and 80 languages, and it turns out that there are within-country and across-country issues that allow us to have trouble making comparisons, and there are these anchoring and behavioral effects. So, for example, places like Singapore, who are always on the top of the thermometer of ability, actually people evaluate themselves as relatively low in their sort of conscientiousness and behavioral components of motivation, where other countries that tend to be kind of low on the ability ladder have very high self-rankings. And so we see these within-country differences that are a challenge. And as well, how do we create an appropriate user experience with speededness in a way that doesn't sacrifice reliability and validity, which is a big challenge right now, especially as we think about these 21st century skills, as we think about the Common Core initiative and the importance of formative assessment and promoting learning in the classroom. But at those points in time where we're doing summative assessment or we're trying to get a standardized sort of reading of learning, how do we do that? And so ETS actually is a world leader in linguistic programming and the automated use of constructed response. We obviously know how to make cognitive tests, and you'd be amazed at how many different tests we make. We're experimenting with video and text-based situational judgment tests, which we're actually going to use with this global business because they're interested in culture fit. So we're going to create scenarios in which we describe what a high-valued employee looks like and provide video of that, and then let people respond, capture that, and then score it. And we care a lot about personality and behavior assessment. So that gives you a kind of feel of what the mission of the center is. I hope this provides some frame for the conversation as the day goes on, from an assessment pipeline, and also the sort of challenges of innovative assessment given these constraints, these realities. And Ted Spencer and I hope Ted addresses this because I actually don't know the answer to it, but when I wear my industrial organizational work hat, the issue of compensatory models, can we really use non-cognitive factors in lieu of these measures of ability? And if we even could, how do we get appropriate measurement of them that won't collapse through the sort of coaching industry that has arisen around standardized achievement? I mean, these are the challenges as we become very practical about how to implement policy. So I think with that, I'm just going to stop. Thank you.
And I'm hoping that the information that I share with you all today will add a bit of a historical context to our broader discussion in the panel. So just to give you some sense of the types of things that I'll be discussing, first of all, I'll start off with a historical analysis, or lineage, if you will, of modern admissions tests in higher education within the United States. And I'll speak a bit about the controversy surrounding standardized testing in college admissions, as well as this idea of reconceptualizing what we mean when we say merit and what that broader construct can represent in different contexts. And then I'll use that information to frame current discourse about standardized testing and merit within the U.S. So with regard to the historical analysis, I'm noticing now that We have a lot of triangles in our panel discussion today. There must be some type of, we must have been connected and not even known it. But if we look at the lineage of the SAT, many scholars suggest that modern admissions tests are descendants of IQ tests, which date back to the early 20th century. And in fact, the earliest version of an IQ test was developed by an individual by the name of Alfred Binet. And this was a French psychologist who wanted to have an instrument really to identify students who had special education needs and to make sure that not only were they identified, but their needs were met within the context of the classroom. Although he developed this instrument for that purpose, he was very reluctant to have it used beyond those very narrowly tailored diagnostic purposes within that particular population of students. But despite those concerns, then we have Goddard, more specifically Henry Goddard and Louis Terman, who advanced Binet's work within the context of the United States. And these were also psychologists who kind of had a different idea around the idea of testing. They actually wanted to, honestly, they wanted to use these exams as a means to kind of calibrate society. More specifically, they wanted to determine the mental and vocational fitness of children who weren't exactly a member of the population of students for which this type of exam was designed. If we were to follow the lineage a little bit further, Robert Yerkes enters the conversation, and he is pretty well known for having been part of developing what is referred to as the Army Alpha Intelligence Test with the assistance of Goddard and Terman. And because of his experiences there, he then went on to recruit Brigham, who we now recognize as the father of the modern SAT. And Brigham had a very instrumental role in these earlier military testing programs that existed within the United States. And that background laid the framework for him to later be approached by the College Board and ETS to develop what we now refer to as the SAT. So I present this information so that you get a sense for how these tests came to be, although we don't talk about them in terms of tapping this idea of intellect in the modern context. It's important to recognize that this is the history from which it has emerged. We often think about ETS in relation to the work that it does with the SAT, but it really is important to recognize that this organization does more than just that type of work. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, and we have an expert here who will let me know if I am, this organization is one of, if not the largest testing organizations within the United States. And they actually have a number of different areas of expertise, which I've tried to illustrate here. Specifically, they do research, they do assessment and development, instructional products and services, as well as test scoring and test administration. Again, just to give you a sense of exactly what the organization does besides developing the SAT, they have a number of products and services. I won't go into the details here, but I just wanted to give you some insight about the organization as a whole, but really to focus on the SAT with this particular presentation, because it does tend to be a controversial topic of discussion oftentimes, and something that we definitely talk about a lot in the context of American colleges and universities. So despite the widespread use of standardized testing and admissions, to have a primary focus on a student's SAT score when determining whether or not they merit access to our selective institutions has become controversial for a number of different reasons. First of all, there are debates about how well the exam actually predicts success, particularly beyond the freshman year in college, and also if you were to look at predictive validity issues outside of, within different institutional contexts. So how well the test predicts outcomes at minority-serving institutions versus predominantly white institutions, for example. And then also how well the exam predicts success for different racial and ethnic minority groups. It's also important to note that test scores are playing an increasingly critical role in this conversation about access. That is important to underscore because we also know that there are some structural barriers that prevent certain groups from having access to proper mechanisms to prepare for the exam. And so, of course, those things ultimately influence who has access to our selective institutions within America. And given that, I believe one of the panelists on the first session discussed how the future of affirmative action is very much up in the air at this point. So these are things we have to think about when we consider focusing really strongly on test scores in terms of determining who merits access. Because there is a common emphasis on test scores and the role that they play in determining how we craft incoming classes oftentimes, it's important that we have a conceptual understanding of how not only test scores, but a variety of other important factors can be used when we talk about merit more broadly. So this framework actually provides some of that insight. It highlights diversity issues and alternative constructs of merit in American higher education, and it specifically outlines not only the various merit constructs, but also how they interplay with inequality and diversity issues to influence various outcomes. So if you're anything like me, you probably cannot see this. Is that correct? Right. I understand because I am visually challenged as well. And so in the next couple of slides, I'll actually parse out different parts of the framework so that we can look at them in a more salient and pointed way. I hope that's helpful for you. Okay, so if we look at the primary construct of merit, it really kind of evolves around this idea of innate intelligence and ability. And this is historically what the SAT has purported to tap into. However, again, I can't say this enough, we must acknowledge the fact that we don't recognize test scores as being some indicator of students' innate intelligence anymore. But for some reason, although we have literature and although we have discussions amongst ourselves about exactly what these test scores represent, the American public, the media, the court systems tend to like to lean or feel more comfortable leaning on these types of scores as an indicator for intellect and who should and who should not have access to our selective institutions. If we look at this primary merit construct, it would suggest that intelligence has a direct effect on the individual test scores as well as their educational goals, and those things in turn have an effect on their outcomes in college, i.e. access. If we now focus on the secondary merit construct, this pretty much involves academic motivation and hard work. And these are other characteristics that colleges and universities normally try to also acknowledge in what's referred to as a more holistic admissions process. I know we've heard that word quite a bit today. And this construct of merit suggests that motivation and hard work have a direct effect on individuals' test scores, as well as other things, their educational goals, their non-cognitive strengths, their social capital, their networks, their preferences, so on and so forth. And those elements then have an influence on their outcomes in college, for example, gaining access. In terms of the tertiary merit construct, the emphasis here is on special talents and sponsorship. And with this particular conceptualization of the construct, we don't see a direct tie between merit as it's defined in this way and test scores, but we do see that those things, those special talents, those sponsorships, do influence the type of social capital that students have access to, the type of networks that they have, the type of preferences that they may develop, and that those things then have an influence on the outcomes. Although it's important to understand the various merit constructs, there are also some diversity and inequality issues that we must privilege to a certain extent in this conversation jointly. Those things would include, for example, opportunity barriers that different types of students may have based upon race, based upon class, gender, nationality, the fact that there are some differences in school quality, there are differences in academic preparation, and that each of these elements actually have an influence on the student's performance on standardized tests. And if we acknowledge these things in this broader conversation about merit, we also have to acknowledge that there are some limitations in each of those constructions of what it means to merit access. Just in terms of some additional insights that we gained from the framework, first of all, there is a connection between an individual's test scores, the quality of the school that they're able to attend, and other different barriers to academic preparation. And although, again, we often like to, not us, but some audiences like to talk about test scores as though they tap into this idea of intelligence. It's really more often a reflection of opportunity gaps as opposed to some indication of an innate deficit in terms of a person's ability to learn. If we use this information to frame current discourse about standardized testing, we do have to acknowledge from a historical perspective that these tests are a descendant of IQ tests, but they don't operate that way in the current context. And we recognize that, there's evidence to suggest that, and we can't press upon the broader public enough that, again, this is not a measure of innate ability. We also recognize that there are strong relationships between a person's background characteristics and their SAT scores. So given those affiliations, even ETS has suggested that these test scores are considered amongst a number of other important factors that also increase a student's potential to do well at our selective institutions. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'll be more than happy to address any questions you may have later.
Okay.
Well, I think we've heard some very interesting stuff, and I wish Steve some good luck in his job. I'm always glad to hear when ETS is trying to do something positive. At the risk of taking that wrong, if we look at the history, which we've gotten a little bit, the idea originally, nearly 100 years ago, was we want to do some assessments that look like they will predict something for white upper-class males in the East Coast, basically. And I think that ethic has sort of kept with the testing programs, even though ACT was intended to be a kind of a broader concept. The idea that what we have in equality, if I can get my slides to come down here, is this Three Musketeers problem. Can you tell me what the slogan of the Three Musketeers was?
One for all for one?
Yeah, one for all and all for one. The idea that there's a single model that we can use, that we can kind of use for everybody, which originally was the concept of these privileged white males, really. And then as other folks came along and applied to school, or the concept of what we were trying to do in education broadened, we just said, well, let's try to stick these folks in and make these tests work for them, instead of saying, what about diversity variance? What about the culture and racial and discrimination kinds of things that are going on? Don't we need to reflect that somehow in our assessments? And I think that has been something that's kept the testing folks back from just trying to fit it into what they did already, rather than to say, let's look at something different. We also have had the problems with grade inflation, so we can't really use grades anymore because they're almost become a constant. And you can only go so far into a curriculum and see how many math courses or foreign language courses somebody's taken before that becomes a constant. So we need something different. And that's what I've really concentrated on in my work, is trying to figure out what there is about people receiving discrimination, cultural and racial and gender differences, and how folks present what they can do in those contexts, and add that into the system. So I've got 8 non-cognitive dimensions, and I think an important way to think about these is that I tried to develop constructs that could then be measured in a number of different ways as you got more specific. So kind of in an inductive model, you wouldn't just take something off the shelf and do the same thing that the testing folks have done, I think, and just say, here, give this to everybody. You have different ways that these dimensions present themselves, and different ways you probably have to assess them for different groups and different contexts. And I have examples of people who've used all sorts of different methods of revising these things, using things from short answer questions, essays, structured items, portfolio assessment to fit their particular situation and their particular group or groups that they're interested in assessing. So you want to think of it as something that's a kind of flexible model, and I'll get to some ways that some folks have used this in different ways shortly. But the self-concept is a typical way to present it, but it's always in the context of your race, your gender, your culture, the particular group that you're in. How would you show that? And not necessarily just the typical measures we've developed over the years for, again, a more traditional way to view that. Same thing with realistic self-appraisal. What part of it is me? What part of it is a system working on me in some way? Is it just that I don't have the ability, or is it just that my high school I went to doesn't have good math courses, or that my teachers don't think much of me, or just what is it? So sorting that out. The third one of these, I think, is a very complex and interesting variable. Every time I get up and talk about racism, I'm always saying, gee, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on right now as we speak here today. Racism, sexism. We have all the stuff about the anti-immigration laws, all the anti-female stuff that's going on, all the challenges to the president, accusing him of being all sorts of things. And so we have a system that structurally works against the best interests of lots of different people in different ways. So one of the really empowering kinds of dimensions you can have, and it's also predictive, and I should say that all of these were selected as variables that you could work with people on. You could develop people, you could change folks, you could change systems, you could break down structures, so it's something you could do and not just a kind of immutable variable that you couldn't do something with. So it's very powerful to be able to say, hey, I can read the system, I can figure out how it's working on me, and I can try to do something about it. It's a very empowering kind of thing to work with somebody to do that. And for the folks that get that, it's very predictive. It's also kind of complicated in that it has a curvilinear kind of relationship to outcome. If you're angry, it doesn't work very well in handling the system. Or if you're naive, and we're getting more students of color and so forth that are more naive these days and say, you know, you're just some guy left over from the 60s, you're talking about racism and stuff. We don't really have that anymore. But again, I think aside from looking at the news, there are lots of structural things that are taking place. So you want someone who kind of is in the middle somewhere, who can handle the system and doesn't necessarily get angry about it or take every opportunity to do something, because that may not be in their best interest. So it's always what will help me work through this system. So we've got leadership. We have some classic definitions, lots of literature out there, but it's usually kind of traditional forms. We shy away from things like people who are gang leaders, sports kinds of things, because that doesn't fit our more traditional way. Gee, you know, we don't want to pick some guy who led the Jets. I guess it was the one of the gangs in the one of our movies about that. But look and see how you may have shown leadership in your family, in your church, in different places outside the traditional system. And that's where you find a lot of the leadership for the people presenting themselves in different ways. Having long-range goals, the system tends to say, shorten up your goals. We don't want to let people like you make long-term plans and succeed in the system, so we're going to make things tough for you to figure out how to get through the system. So the folks that are able to have a long-range goal and link it to another goal do better, and you can help students set that up. Having a support person, in this case it's an individual. Have you had somebody that's really turned you back into the system? If you look at some of our most successful folks of color, they've had somebody who really pushed them, a family member, somebody in the community, whatever. But it's tough to make it on your own without that kind of individual, and you can try to pick up others along the way. Having a community, even though it might be a gang or some group that you hadn't thought of, but some place to process what's happening to you and what's the system and so forth. And then the last of these, non-traditional learning. What have you picked up aside from the classroom? That's a real bias we have in higher ed. We tend not to think anything that you picked up outside what we've been teaching you somewhere formally is important. So I think because people who are discriminated against get pushed out of the system more, they're much more likely to learn through other parts of their life that aren't in the formal academy. So just a quick rundown to give you a flavor. I've written a lot about these things, a lot about how to measure them. I do want to get on and talk about some of the advantages of this. Research-based, so for critics who say, you know, yeah, you're sort of a do-gooder, what about this stuff? Can you really measure it? Lots of studies on that, different ways to assess it, particularly retention-related. And I've had a lot of recent interest in using this internationally, which I'll get to. There have been several legal tests that have supported it. And again, you can revise it and make it your thing. I think the way you really get change in the world, certainly in our business, is to make it the unit's own thing, to make, if Michigan were to use it, to make it Michigan's thing rather than my thing or based on some study somewhere. And one of the real biggies here is this stuff doesn't cost anything. So I make all these measures and studies and whatnot that I've done available at no cost. So you don't need a grant or a lot of money or whatever. There's always some thing you can do or somebody's experience that's similar to your institution that can go ahead and use this stuff. It's good for student development. The student affairs folks like it. Some people have used it in all these different areas, financial aid, student services, etc. Community building. High school counselors like it too, so it's something besides just processing paper and trying to get people into the latest school of interest. So I want to mention just a couple of big programs that have used this, and then mention a couple of others just in passing. The Gates Millennium Scholars Program, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. This is the basic format that you need Pell Grant eligible folks. So low-income students of color, basically from the groups that are mentioned there. And 80% of the way they get selected is based on these non-cognitive variables I just mentioned. We happen to have a couple of readers here. Every January, I train a bunch of folks of color from the different racial groups, and we have Connie Tinkson-Gattus from Madonna College here, and I know we have Marie Ting from the campus here, both of whom have been readers in this program. And what we do is review the whole application, and there are lots of places that are built in to get this information. Here's what the award provides. As you can see, it's a $1.75 billion program. So Gates has a lot of money. And you can go to school for up to 9 years in this program, 4 years undergraduate, or 5 undergraduate, 4 grad, and particularly in those areas. And so the students have ended up in some of the most selective schools in the country and doing extremely well, as you can see. If I were to just throw out the idea, what would you expect the retention rate for a group of low-income students of color from the various groups that I have here in whatever school they attended? What would you guess the retention to be, roughly, for that group? Somebody want to throw out an idea? Be around 25% maybe. Eventually there'd be all kinds of reasons why people wouldn't make it through school. So let's take a look at what's happened to these folks. At this stage, it started in 2000, we have over 15,000 folks selected. They're attending some of the most selective schools in the country, the Ivy Leagues. Michigan's here has had a number of them. About 60% major in the STEM fields. So we can see we have very high graduation rates, just about the highest of any cohorts you could think of anywhere. You can see it attending over 1,500 different colleges and universities. And in some of the research that Ed St. John has done, we've been on an advisory group to this program. as the students get the money, they're more likely to attend more selective schools, private schools, and residential schools. So rather than to go to the local community college, they're much more apt to go somewhere else if they get a chance. And so again, you can go to Harvard for 9 years, and you can imagine what that would cost. The university that's probably done the most with this is Oregon State in Corvallis, where they had kind of a natural experiment about a dozen years ago where the state board said, okay, Oregon and Oregon State, you've got to cut back on your admissions. And Oregon State went the route to try some of these non-cognitive variables. And this is their research, and you can see the kinds of things that have happened to them. They've increased their diversity, their GPA's up, they award scholarships better, they do referrals around the campus better based on these. Some of their colleges in particular, like their College of Engineering, is one of the real leaders in using these dimensions. They've started courses and services and so forth. So they've really done lots of things in relation to that. Now, just a partial list of some of the other places, and I want to briefly mention these in the context of some of our international focus we've had here. One of the things I just heard is that Sydney University in Australia is using these dimensions to select Aboriginal students, one of their classic problems they've had for many years. University of British Columbia there has a problem that their mean or average, grade point average for their applicants is the 3.8 on a 4 system. So they've really got no variability in that input, so they need something else to get their admissions done. We have Goshen College in Indiana, small Mennonite school. Their idea of diversity is to try to get some non-Mennonites to come there because they realize that they're limited. Lehigh in Pennsylvania, a traditional kind of white male engineering school, has realized that, hey, you know, there's a shortage of those folks, and we're fighting with the Ivies to try to get them in here. We need a larger pool to choose from, and how are we going to do that? And they're trying to do that based on what they're doing. Prairie View in Texas is a historically black school that, according to them, stayed in business because they were able to demonstrate what they could do on these non-cognitive dimensions rather than just be a place that was no longer necessary as you were desegregating in Texas. And one of the interesting ones is I was in Japan at Nagoya University just before the tsunami hit, and they are trying to use these non-cognitive variables to have a worldwide English-speaking program as they draw people from all over the world with all different kinds of records and transcripts and whatnot, and they needed a more standardized way to do this. So lots of different places using this for their view of what diversity is, and each of these places is doing it a little differently. Their assessments aren't exactly the same, and that's I think the big thing, that if you allow people to kind of build it into what they're doing rather than have it be a national thing that everyone has to use in exactly the same way, I think we have a much better chance to have change. And I do have a commercial here for some other references. I have all kinds of studies that I and others have done. If you're interested in this, by all means, email me. I'm a sucker for any positive regard. If you say, gee, you know, I'm really doing this. And I really hear from lots of folks, and people are doing theses and dissertations, all kinds of stuff. And so I've got something that would probably interest you or can put you in touch with a school that may be doing something similar to what you want to do, and or a program. Lots of times it's just one program at the school. So that's kind of my pitch, and I'd be glad to answer questions in a bit. Thanks.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to have this opportunity to talk to you, but I tell you, my ADD that I have has meant that every time I've heard a presentation, I've changed my own presentation. So I've got a whole lot of stuff I want to talk about now, and I don't know if any of it has to do with using tests in a holistic way, but I'm going to try to do that. I guess the first thing I want to do is is at least mention someone that, as we talk about the legal issues, someone who was very important to the University of Michigan and someone who I at least want to honor his memory, and that's John Payton. I don't know how many of you knew John, but John was our lawyer who defended us both at the District Court, the Circuit Court in Cincinnati, and the Supreme Court. And he was the legal defense counsel head of the NAACP for up until his death this past week. John was quite a guy. He actually won a decision at the Circuit Court that said that the system that we were using a point system, was in fact legal. John was a part of that team that then moved it on to the Circuit Court, and the Circuit Court never ruled on the undergraduate case, but did overturn the district court ruling for the law school and said that the law school, in fact, holistic system was the one that was most constitutional. And then finally, the Supreme Court, in hearing Grutter and Gratz, basically Sandra Day O'Connor said that while she understood it was impractical for large universities to review 25,000 files in a holistic system, today we have 40,000, she felt that administrative inconvenience was no excuse. And so we moved to a holistic system. We, being the University of Michigan, moved to a holistic system, which was not that much different than the one that we used before, except we got rid of numbers. In fact, I was so anti-numbers, I even thought, I called the athletic director and said, you know, this number thing can get you in trouble. So on the scoreboard, let's just use good when we score, bad when the other team does. So we moved from that to a much more holistic way of interpreting each record. It's difficult, and one of the things I want to talk about John Payton on, and I think it was something that's important to this discussion, he used to talk about we the people. And we the people, to him, talked about all the people who were in this room that probably wouldn't have been here back in the days when the SAT was started, and back in the days when Harvard had a good old boy system of admissions. In fact, the SAT at that time was really supposed to be a fair way of admitting people versus my friend called or alumni called and got you into school, and a fair way was to have some sort of test that might make it such that all people could be included. But in those days, immigrants were not a part of the we the people. Non-Protestants were not a part of that. Women, poor, people of color, and all kinds of other categories were not a part of we the people. And it was very difficult for them to get into a college or a university. And in some ways, the tests sort of helped some of those East Coast schools sort of evolve from the good old boy system to the one that was trying to create equality in some ways, and not maybe very clumsily in admitting folks to the very private schools. The issue of how you use tests in a holistic way, and the only way to describe it is that it's complicated and it depends. It depends on the college or university. You know, for the universities that admit 70 to 80% of the students, the holistic use of tests is not that important, because they're going to admit the majority of the students who apply regardless of what their test scores are. There is a threshold perhaps, but for most of those schools that fall into that category, it's not that important. Now we have a number of schools like Harvard and Yale that admit 7% or 9%, I call that the lunatic fringe, and they only take about 1,200 students. And so in order to find a way to discern between those students and using even a holistic system, the test scores have a much more of an impact in how they end up enrolling their students. At the University of Michigan, we probably fall into the 42% range of admit. We have a much larger enrollment each year of about 6,000 students, so we can admit some 13,000 students or 12,000 each year in order to bring in the class that we're looking for. Our mission, though, says that we're looking for students who have excelled both academically and also extracurricularly, or extracurricular activities. And so we had to develop a system, a holistic system, that would allow for that. And so there are a lot of non-cognitive things as a part of our system in order to get our students here. Now, let me just give you some data about some of the kids that enrolled at Michigan. The average GPA today is around 3.8. The average ACT score is around 31. The average SAT is about 1380. We have about 8% of our students are African American, about 4% are Hispanic, about 1% are Native American, and about 12% are Asian Americans. The graduation rate, well, first of all, the return rate of our students overall is 96% from the freshman year to the sophomore year. The national average is about 67%. We graduate in a 5-6 year period about 90% of our students. The average graduation rate is somewhere in the range of 50%. We also, our African American students graduate at about 75% rate in our graduation rates for African American students, which is higher than the national average. Our Hispanic students are slightly higher than that, around 80, and our Asian students and white students are around 90% in that range. So the process that we're using in the holistic system for us has been somewhat successful. We need to do more. There are a lot of things that we can do better. And of course, we have some challenges, and a lot of those challenges have to do with things that we don't control. We don't control the school systems. We don't control the curriculums of students who come to our campus. Of those 40,000 applications we received last year, 2/3 of them came from out-of-state students. And so we have a variety of different test scores, different averages, different grading systems. And so in our process of looking at those files, we have to figure out a way to make certain we get the right students, but not using tests alone, using many, many other factors, and that's what we do. You know, the tests, in fact, even help us with grade inflation. You know, when we see a group of students from a high school that have 4-point grade point averages and their test scores on the ACT is around 24 or 25, that tells us there's grade inflation. But on the other hand, we may see a school where the average GPA is around 3.5. It may be around 3.4, and the test scores are, in the case of an SAT, around 1,500, 1,400, or 1,300. That tells us that they are probably grading pretty hard, or they're including many, many factors in that grading system. So the test scores can be important in a lot of ways, and we have to consider that. The non-cognitive pieces that we look at include everything from whether the person is a student who speaks English as a second language. So when we're looking at a test, a group of tests, and we're looking at a group of students who may have a very strong math score, but in fact the English score is not that strong. It's looking at the application, reading the stories, telling them, finding out what they've said about themselves, what the counselors have said about us, but looking at the context, looking at those test scores in context, the context of what's the student's background. We know we have a number of students from urban areas and rural areas, and in many cases their academic preparation in the schools that they attend don't have the kinds of curriculum that will allow them to be as competitive. Now that doesn't mean they aren't qualified, but they may not be as competitive. And so we have to look at those students in a different context as well. The test scores are also looked at in the context of those students from those environments. Each of our colleges that we admit to have different, in many cases, requirements, both in terms of test scores, in terms of academic achievements, in terms of all the kinds of things that they've done, in terms of interest in a particular school or college. And so the context of how we view those test scores, both in terms of those students and that particular unit. It's important also to understand that when we look at test scores, we look at them from the environment in which those students came. So for example, if the average test score in a high school is 25 and the student we're looking at has a strong curriculum in that school, they took the best courses that were offered. That 25 may not be as competitive as that 31 that I just mentioned for the average school students that come here. But in the context, that's one of the best students in that school, and we will probably take that sort of student. The other thing that's important about this notion of holistic review and test scores, we really give more credit to the student that did 4 years of work in high school well than the student who did 4 hours on a test and received a high score. So, for example, if the student has a 1450 and yet they didn't challenge the curriculum in high school and they have C's in their curriculum, that student is not as likely to be admitted as the student who, for example, may have an A average, who has challenged the curriculum, taking AP courses and honors courses, and not as strong of a test score. Now, it could be that student just had a bad day testing, so we look for trends, and we try to figure out. Now, if a student, for example, took a test in the 9th grade and then in the 10th grade, and we saw an upward trend, that can be a factor in us admitting that student as well. So it's not just the test. It's the test in combination with the transcript. It's the test in combination with their environment. It's a test in the context of all those things that we would think that we would want on our campus. And I do think that in some ways the tests have gotten sort of a bad rap. And I, for years, was one of the people who thought that they were culturally biased, and then maybe they are even today. But in terms of how you use them, which is what both the SAT and ACT people have said for years. Don't use this test as the only means to admit students to your school. Use it perhaps as an eye giving you an idea of maybe the student's ability. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons we've been successful. I think that's one of the reasons that our students have graduated and are doing well. That gap between minority students and majority students is still something we need to work on in terms of graduation rates. The gap, when you look at the overall test scores, for example, when I had some data, when we presented to the Supreme Court, we received some data from both the SAT and ACT that I think helped us convince the course of the compelling interest of a critical mass. And that data pretty much showed the average SAT test scores and ACT test scores based on a GPA of, say, A, and a test score of 25, 26, we cut it a number of different ways. But if you look at the city of Detroit, for example, no, I'm sorry, in the state of Michigan, it's not just the city of Detroit. That data showed that in the state of Michigan, when we looked at African-American students who took the ACT and who had at least an A- average and an SAT score, an ACT score of 26, that number for the whole state of Michigan was about 200 kids. Now, I know I'll say that again. That number in the whole state was about 200 kids. Now, I gave you our profile earlier, much higher than that. And so the use of test scores are not the only thing that we look at when we admit students. And I'll talk more about some of those things later on in my other section when we talk about the holistic review process and how we use many other factors and still trying to accomplish our diversity. I want to just add one other thing. Even if the Supreme Court comes down with a decision that's not as positive as the Grutter versus Gratz, because of the proposition, we've really developed a system that already does not use race as one of many factors. The worst thing that can happen to us would be if they did something with the outreach piece. That would be a very difficult piece for us because that's one of the things we rely on very heavily. But I think we've developed a system of sorts that is working fairly well, but needs a lot of work all the time and a lot of attention. Test scores are important. They're not the only factor. In fact, I would say in terms of relativity for the University of Michigan, great point. The courses that the students take, the way they write about themselves, the way their counselors write about them are the most important factors in our decision. So with that, I'm going to shut up and sit down and let you all get ready for lunch and maybe ask some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted. And before we ask for comments and questions, let's give the panelists a round of applause.
Gloria Thomas. I'm the director of the Center for the Education of Women, and I actually spent 8 years doing admissions. And I'm wondering, this question I'll direct at Krystal, but would love to hear others talk a little bit about, because I noticed you didn't cover the ACT in your research. And I wondered what the feelings are, the response to the differences. William, you mentioned that the ACT strives to be broader, and I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about the differences. And if you like to speak to the use of achievement tests, not the AP placement exams, and how that helps in the selection. I'm assuming that a lot of the more selective schools will use the SAT, but I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Honestly, the crux of my research pretty much focused on the SAT in the spirit of full disclosure. I don't really know a lot about the history of the ACT. It's my understanding, and I could be incorrect, but it's my understanding that it has traditionally not lent on to this idea of tapping intellect as strongly from a historical perspective. But that's pretty much the bulk of what I know. I specifically focused on the SAT because at that point in time, I was really trying to delve pretty deeply into that particular exam, given that oftentimes when we hear about controversy, we're talking about the SAT. At least when I'm sitting at tables and we're having discussions, they tend to evolve around that test, but I'd be more than interested in hearing if any of the panelists here have any different ideas about the question.
Steve, why don't you give us a little...
We have a resident expert.
So. Well, I was vice president of research at ACT, so I guess the correlation between the ACT and the SAT is 0.92. So maybe the more fundamental question is, how do we know what people have learned and what they can learn? And how do tests help provide insight into this point in time of what they've mastered as well as what they may master? And I think I would reframe the question as, how do we do that? And how do we level the playing field so that we can take into account school level rigor differences? We can take into account what Cronbach used to call maximal versus typical performance. So GPA is a powerful predictor of performance because it includes learning and motivation, where SAT and ACT really are a more pure measure of maximal performance. It's what you've learned to date. So the question, I think, is, given the selectivity of your institution, how does ability moderate likely success? And the reality is, for example, University of Iowa had the lowest retention rates of any Big Ten school, and Ed Pascarella, being kind of a wise guy, because he got to be, said, well, just raise the admission scores. The retention rates will dramatically improve. So it's really, what's the policy implications of the institution in terms of its commitment for success, even as you control for ability as a moderator, if that makes sense. So I don't think it's so much about which is a better test, the achievement-based or the historic aptitude-based, because they end up pretty much serving the same function, which is to measure at this point in time what you know. So then I think the real question is, on top of that, how do you get a good indicator of a student's fit with your institution, their likely commitment to persevere, their intentionality to succeed? How do you admit students who play different seats in a symphony rather than them all playing the tuba? And so I think I would just say that it's not about the test. I think Ted, in a way, is trying to address this. It's about these broader issues and the fact is, Michigan is a highly selective institution with variability in its test scores, but I would be shocked if Ted would say publicly he's willing to lower the average entering scores of their students or the yield rates. And so, so I would just reframe your question a little bit.
Ted, any comment, or just ask for another question, any comment?
Yeah, I have something to say there. I think, can you hear me? No, there we go. I think we get trapped into the idea, hey, this is the only way we can improve the quality, et cetera. You go after a certain kind of student with a certain kinds of abilities, and in some ways that's fine. You'll end up with a traditional sort of class then, and you'll leave out lots of folks who could do well at your institution, but you're not looking at the ways that they could present what they can do. So that's why I would use anything you can, but I would make sure to expand the dimensions that you do pursue. And you can get things like, I've worked with the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, one of our military academies, and they're interested in people that can handle all different kinds of tough situations, international smugglers, all sorts of things. So they need more than just a bunch of folks that have military orientation. So for them, they need some other kinds of dimensions. And if we want to be fair, one of the titles of this seminar is Merit. Then you want to make sure that you cover a range of ways that people could present what they do. And even though you could get a bunch of students in using just one measure, if you leave others out who could do well, but you're not looking at the right dimensions, then you're not really being fair.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that, and again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how you read the files and what you look for. You know, I personally read the files backwards. Now, let me tell you what that means. I start with the counselor comments, and then I look at the essays, and then I look at the high school GPA, and then I look at the test scores. And I generally come away with about the same conclusion or the same recommendation doing it that way even if I use the test scores primarily. And I think it's because in a holistic process and the kind of questions that we ask of students and the kind of questions we ask of the counselors, we have a pretty good idea of who those students are. And so it makes it easier. Now, that would say that I could eliminate test scores altogether. And for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier, they really help us really solidify and really confirm a lot of that information that I read in that file without even having looked at the test scores. It says that this is a pretty good student, or it says why that student is not such a good student on exams. And that, here again, those are some of the kind of things that we take into consideration. I worry, though, about one thing that was mentioned earlier. The more students hear about our grade point averages and our test scores, I worry that there will be more self-selection out of the process. And so we have to be very careful how we explain those numbers. And one of the things we do, and most colleges do, we talk about a mid-50% range when we talk about the test scores. And then, of course, with that, there are 25% of the people below it and above it. And so I may say to some parents, they're going to be 25% below this. It may not be your kid, but we're going to build a class with some people who are in that 25% lower range for test scores as well as GPAs.
Comments or questions? There's, I think there's two, Eric and then Percy. First here.
If I'm remembering the slide that William Sedlacek put up about the Gates Millennial Scholars and the non-cognitive variables, and the first year, I think, retention rates were about 97%, and when you looked at the 4-year graduation rates, it was about maybe 57, which seemed to put it about at national average. So if I've got that correct, to what might you attribute that drop in graduation rate for the 4-year schools, if I saw that slide right? And if not, if you could correct me on that.
Yeah. No, I think the slide I had up there briefly, but that 57% was kind of the national average. The GMS scholars are much higher than that all the way around. It seems to me they're up in the 70s, I think it was, for 4 years, and up in the 80s if you give them longer. So they're much higher than any matching cohort. And I might add one more thing is to show you we're after some different variants there. The SAT or ACT scores of the folks that get turned down for that scholarship are actually higher than the ones that get selected. So we intentionally do not look at that particular dimension, and yet these people do as well as they do.
Percy?
Percy Bates School of Ed, U of M. Okay.
Every time I hear a talk about the use of test scores, I guess I have to realize that I've been on both sides of the ledger here, so I guess that makes me a flip-flopper. But I think I have concluded, though, and I think Ted really did address this, because there are people, I think, who believe we should get rid of testing altogether. And I really worry if we didn't have some kind of objective measure and went completely to what somebody thinks, what a given class would actually look like. So I guess I think I heard Ted say that we ought to keep some sort of objective measure as we do other things. But I guess if others have a notion that we could live somehow without them, I'd like to hear that. But I guess my own conclusion, at least as of now, is that some level of objective measure does make sense in whatever we do.
Well, I might just add, I think you can get objective measurements of these non-cognitive variables if that's what you wish to do. You can use structured items that are available. You can do reliability checks, run all your kinds of equations as usual. So there's nothing to suggest that they're just subjective or they're just people's opinions, because you're using stimulus response type measurement just like you would in any kind of assessment that you have. So it is possible to do that, and you definitely don't want to think of just because it's a different variable means that somehow it's subjective.
I'll jump in and just, on Sed's point, and I'm telling Sed now because I just thought of this, in a way, Sed's non-cognitive questionnaire is a behavioral interview, which turns out to be quite robust in the workforce selection arena. So I think it tends to be more expensive and because it's more intensive, less transactional in a sense, but it also provides the kind of utility that he's been describing. But I think the question was about objective measures of ability, not objective measures in general. And I have to tell you that the literature is so clear on this that ability drives task performance. Now, how do you become able and how you've acquired knowledge requires all these other non-cognitive factors. But at any point in time, what a person knows is going to drive their ability to learn or to be trained or to be successful in education or the workplace. And it's not the only piece, but it's an essential piece, and that's why I proposed that foundational element in my pyramid, because it's just a driver of task performance. And to be just sort of a polemic about this, I mean, I think we would be naive not to want to understand that measurement. And then the challenge is, how do you use it in the context that Ted and Krystal and Sed have been talking about?
Yeah, I'll interject one comment, since this is an area that I've done some work on historically as well. And there's also some evidence to suggest that ability and motivation function in a multiplicative way. That is, if you have ability and no motivation, there's no performance. And if you have motivation, no ability, there's no performance. You know, that's an alternative framing that there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that if it is the successful behavior or performance that you want, that one would be hard put to indicate that one operates independent of the other. You know, and that there's a lot of evidence that that if you model it, there are some multiplicative function there. You know, that really suggests that that ability and motivation are fairly fundamental to successful performance outcomes.
Absolutely, but to push back a second, to lay this at the feet of University of Michigan, I love not being in an executive role. I can be less disciplined in what I say. So if you don't have a snapshot of a student's readiness to succeed in your general ed courses, you set students up for failure. Absolutely. So they may be, and the example I would give, and this goes back, I actually redid the ACT score report 12 years ago after 2 previous failed launches because it's so complicated to redo those systems. And we did a very methodical approach. We polled live results of valedictorians of schools and flew out there and showed them their current report and the new proposed report, which we paid to mock up. And I went to a high school, the valedictorian had an ACT score of 19. Now that student was highly motivated, did everything they were supposed to do as part of their contract, and the school let that student down. But the question is, if that student came to the University of Michigan, could they take your college algebra course? Could they take your reading and writing intensive courses? And are you committed to help them work on, use their strengths, but to bring them along in terms of their achievement ability levels? That becomes the policy implication.
I would just add to that, and I agree with that 100%. It's, knowing your institution, knowing the environment, you don't want to bring someone here who you would think would have a better chance of failing than being successful. And our university does not offer any remedial courses, and very few introductory courses. And so if someone is too far off that mark, or whatever that mark is, using all of the kinds of things that I talked about in trying to evaluate that student's ability to be successful. I mean, we know that parents who go to college, even if their kids don't score well on exams, will generally graduate. They may not have the strongest GPA, but they will graduate. But we also know that the students who are less likely to graduate are probably the ones whose parents earn the least amount of money and who don't have as higher education level. That's not to say at all colleges, but at places like Michigan, where it's very competitive, that kind of data still exists and is very strong. Chris had a question over there.
Okay, I think we have time for one more, Chris.
All right, I'll keep it short. I'm Christopher Tremblay.
I'm sorry. I wanted to chime in. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to miss the timing. But I did want to chime in because in listening to the exchange from here and also reflecting on the initial question, I think it also speaks to the idea of how much we really value diversity in our institutions and how much we're willing to invest in not necessarily remediation, but more so having the support mechanisms in place so that we identify the students who may come in with some academic challenges, so to speak, but we also recognize that that's not a reflection on their ability to be successful, the end all and be all. And so if we want those types of students here, because we recognize that certain students just, for whatever reason, because of different academic barriers, don't have access to resources to prepare, how much are we willing to invest in their success here by having mechanisms in place to support that outcome?
I agree with that.
Great point. Final comment, question.
All right. My name is Christopher Tremblay. I'm in enrollment management at the Dearborn campus. And actually, I want to challenge one of Steve's slides, your architecture slide. I thought it was noteful that you had work coming after college, and I was curious about any research that's been done about the role of work, both in terms of impacting a student's success, if that work starts in high school and continues through college. And I say that from personal experience, having my parents required me to get a job when I turned 15, and how some of those jobs impacted the work, the reason that I do the work that I do today. And so just curious about the role of that and your model.
It's a great question. I'm glad you raised it. This is going to be a defensive answer, as I really stink at PowerPoint. And it's a total iterative process. I just couldn't figure out how to model that. For example, we work a lot, ETS works a lot with community colleges. We all believe, I think the philosophical belief is that everyone should graduate high school and have some post-secondary experience to be able to get a middle skill, livable wage job, Zone 3 in the ONET system. And so it's not necessarily a traditional path through 4-year, and that I would actually say that by 6th grade, if you're not addressing the behaviors that are expected in a workplace within the educational context, we're doing a disservice in that notion of pipeline. And I think from the social capital perspective, many disadvantaged students don't have role models to see what it means to meaningfully work, or what it means to work successfully, what it means to show up in a workplace, to be appropriately dressed, et cetera, et cetera. So I absolutely agree with you. That slide is mostly a representation of my poor visual spatial skills and ability to figure out how to make it represent. But I think we should be addressing the world of work and career readiness at least from 6th grade on.